I got this story from a man who asked me not to use his name. That was one of the first conditions. I'll call him Marcus. He spent 28 years with the Department of Defense, most of it in biological containment operations, the kind of thing that doesn't have a public face and barely has an internal one. He reached out to me in late 2023 because he was sick, and because he said the statute of limitations on his secrecy agreements had effectively run out when his own lungs did. Marcus is dead now, pancreatic cancer. Fairly quick once they found it. But before he went, he sat down with a digital recorder and walked me through 2 decades of paperwork and field reports that he'd kept, against regulation, in a filing cabinet in his garage. Before we dive in, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more untold stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single episode. And if you find this story compelling, leave a like and a comment below. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The story starts in 2014, northeastern Nevada, about 90 miles north of Elko, in a part of the state that is exactly as empty as Nevada sounds. The operation was called Keystone. The official designation on the paperwork was Wildlife Management Intervention Zone 7. What that meant was that an entity had been found, and an intelligence had decided that whatever it was needed to be contained. The report came in through a private surveying company working a land assessment for a mining consortium looking at uranium and other mineral prospects in the high desert. The surveyors were running a standard geological and ecological survey, drones doing aerial coverage, ground teams doing baseline inventories. One of the ground teams, about 40 miles into a survey zone in the Ruby Mountains, found something in a rocky canyon system that shouldn't have been there. At first they thought it was a bear. That was what went into the initial report. Animal behavior, predator activity, large apex animal. But the photographs told a different story. The team had documented a structure, an actual built shelter. Not a den or a cave, but something constructed. Rocks stacked and mortared with what looked like clay, branches woven into a rough frame, a front facing that suggested an interior divided into sections. The surveying company contacted the Nevada Department of Wildlife. The Department of Wildlife contacted the Forest Service. The Forest Service contact went up the chain to a regional office in Portland. And somewhere in that process, the call got transferred to a federal agency that didn't exist on any public list. Marcus got the call 2 days later. His job was to assess the site and determine whether the structure had human origin or animal origin, straightforward enough on the surface. If it was human, it was a squatter issue or a historical structure, handled by local law enforcement or the historical society. If it was animal, it might be something worth studying, something for wildlife research. He flew to Reno the next day. He flew into a small airfield north of Elko in a Learjet with 2 other people, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who was a mammalian biologist with federal credentials, and a man named Colonel James Henricks, who handled the logistics side for the agency. The site was accessible only by vehicle on roads that didn't appear on commercial maps, 43 miles of high desert dirt track, elevation climbing steadily from 3,900 feet to over 6,000. The terrain was open, sagebrush and scattered juniper, the kind of space where you can see for miles, and there's nothing but rock formations and empty horizon. When they reached the site, Marcus said the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the quality of it. Absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the wind moving through the sparse vegetation. And the animals. Ravens that should have been everywhere in that place were simply gone. The shelter was exactly as the survey team had photographed it. Maybe 12 feet across, 10 feet deep. Constructed with a care that suggested either extreme competence or extreme patience or both. The building technique was sophisticated. The rocks had been selected for size and shape, fitted together in a way that distributed weight evenly. The mortar between them was a mixture that Dr. Chen would later identify as clay mixed with plant fibers, a binding agent that required knowledge of material properties and construction engineering. This was not the work of an animal. This was the work of an intelligence, something with the capacity to plan a structure and understand how to make it stable. Inside, there were objects. That was the detail that changed the whole thing. Not just a nest or a den, but a collection of things that suggested intention and storage. Stones that had been worked, some of them into rough shapes. A few appeared to have been knapped or deliberately fractured, the way you would create a sharp edge for cutting, bones cleaned and arranged in patterns. Some were laid out side by side, some were stacked. The arrangement suggested organization, categorization, the way a human would organize tools or supplies. Feathers bundled together with what looked like plant material wrapped around them. What looked like a wooden bowl or a container of some kind, rough but deliberate, carved from a single piece of wood with a hollow interior. The workmanship suggested this had taken considerable time to create. In one corner of the shelter, there was an arrangement that Dr. Chen photographed extensively. It was a sequence of objects laid out in a line, small colored stones, then feathers, then bones arranged in a pattern, then what appeared to be strips of weathered fabric, some of it possibly from human clothing. The arrangement seemed intentional, possibly decorative, possibly ritualistic. It was the kind of arrangement that suggested meaning. Dr. Chen photographed everything. She took measurements, she collected samples of the mortar, she documented the bone assemblages and tried to determine what species they came from. Marcus walked around the structure and looked at the ground beyond it. Tracks, large prints, bipedal, five-toed, deep and recent. The stride length suggested something roughly 7 feet tall. The prints led away from the shelter, heading deeper into the canyon system. Henricks was on a satellite phone the whole time, talking to someone higher up the chain, reporting what they were finding. His tone suggested that whoever he was talking to already knew what was going to be found. They spent 6 hours at the site. They packed the shelter carefully, removed the objects, documented the structure. By the time they left, there was evidence of human presence all over the place. The structure was torn down, the ground disturbed, the artifacts collected for analysis. Back in Reno, in a conference room at the Learjet hangar, Henricks told them what came next. The site was now classified. Everyone who had access to it was to be read into the classification. Nobody talked, nobody filed reports outside the compartment. The area became restricted federal land, managed by a bureau that didn't exist on the organizational chart. The mining consortium was contacted and informed that their survey access had been terminated. They were paid enough that they didn't push back. Dr. Chen was brought into a full briefing. She was given a copy of the Book of Enoch, the version in the appendix to the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, specifically the section known as the Book of the Watchers. Henricks told her to read the first 36 chapters. He told her that the department had been tracking a population of what the document called the egregori, or the Watchers, for longer than officially documented. What she was looking at in the artifacts from the shelter was consistent with a mid-level developmental complexity for this species. Marcus was given a different brief. He was shown satellite imagery dating back to the 1980s, multiple locations across Nevada and Northern California and Southern Oregon, shelters, all of them. Built structures ranging from simple to sophisticated, some of them showing signs of habitation going back decades. The agencies had known. For decades they had known something was building structures in the high desert, and they had been watching in silence. The containment operation wasn't going to be a capture, it was going to be a facilitated removal. They were going to establish a controlled environment, an enclosure that would house what was estimated to be a population of between 6 and 9 individuals, and they were going to bring them in. How do you bring in something like that? That was Marcus's first question. Henricks told him that the original site Marcus had assessed had been bait. The structure was known to be monitored by the group that built it. They had been leaving markers, visiting regularly, maintaining what was essentially a way station in their migration pattern. What the survey team had done, and what Marcus's team would do, was set up a more sophisticated trap, an enclosure that looked natural, that invited occupation, that had everything the creatures would want. The enclosure was constructed over the next 6 weeks. It was a canyon section, roughly rectangular, 4 miles north of the original shelter site, with sheer rock walls on 3 sides and a single narrow entrance. The canyon was geographically perfect for what they wanted to do. The walls rose nearly 300 feet on 2 sides, sheer stone with no climbing route that anything large could use. The third side was a rock face that sloped at an angle that a human climber might traverse, but something the size of the creatures would find difficult. The single entrance was the only viable access point, a narrow gap between rock outcroppings that funneled anything trying to pass through a single path. The entrance was sealed with a barrier system that looked like natural rockfall from the outside, but was actually steel and controlled mechanisms on the inside. The system had taken 3 weeks to design and 4 weeks to install and test. The mechanics were straightforward. When the creatures passed through the entrance, weight-sensitive plates in the canyon floor would detect the passage. Once all monitored individuals had passed through, an actuated gate would swing closed, sealing the entrance with steel panels that looked, from outside the canyon, like a natural collapse. From inside, the panels were clearly artificial, but they were also clearly indestructible. The mechanism had redundant hydraulic systems and backup electrical power. The designers had built it, assuming that something with the strength of a large bear might try to force it open. The system could withstand that pressure indefinitely. The trap was baited with objects similar to the ones found in the original shelter: tools, crafted pieces, things that demonstrated human technology, but in forms that would appeal to something studying humans. A hunting knife, deliberately aged and weathered to suggest it had been in the desert for years. A woven basket made from plant material, water-stained as if it had been exposed to the elements. A carved wooden figurine of a human form, crude but recognizable. Clothing, old and weathered, pieces that had been in storage for decades. A small mirror, wrapped in fabric, positioned so that the creatures would find it and understand that it was an artifact of value. All of it carefully placed to suggest that humans had been here, that something worth investigating was present, that the canyon held the remnants of human passage and human intention. Dr. Chen led the artifact preparation. She studied the objects from the original shelter obsessively, trying to understand what patterns of interest they represented. The bones were organized by type, with larger bones separated from smaller ones. The worked stones were gathered in small piles of similar pieces. The feathers were bundled, the arrangement suggesting categorization or sorting. She spent hours considering what these organizational patterns meant. Were the bones being saved for a purpose? Were the stones being prepared for tools? Were the feathers being collected for insulation or decoration or ritual? She replicated these patterns in the bait objects, trying to think like an intelligence that was thinking like a human, trying to understand what would be attractive to a mind that was observing human culture and attempting to understand it. Marcus was involved in the physical construction. He worked with a private contracting firm that had security clearance and experience with sensitive installations. They built the enclosure in 2 phases. The first phase was the barrier system at the entrance, which took weeks to test and refine. The second phase was the containment infrastructure, hidden in the canyon walls, monitoring systems, suppression systems, reinforced structures that could hold a large, powerful creature in the event that the psychological attraction of the bait wasn't enough. By early August 2014, the enclosure was ready. The bait objects were in place. The monitoring systems were live. And they waited. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. Marcus said the silence in that desert canyon was suffocating. The teams monitoring the site, the surveillance feeds, the satellite imagery, all of it showed nothing. No movement, no approach, no interest in the bait. Then, at 2 a.m. on August 17th, the infrared sensors at the barrier entrance detected movement. Something large, 4-legged initially, then shifting to bipedal as it approached the entrance. Over the next 4 hours, 7 individuals passed through the barrier. They moved cautiously, one at a time, stopping frequently, examining the environment before proceeding. Once all 7 were through, the barrier was activated. Electronic locks engaged. The rockfall formation sealed the entrance. The animals were contained. Henricks called a briefing for dawn. By that time, there was high-resolution video of the interior canyon from multiple angles, infrared heat signatures of the 7 individuals, and real-time audio feeds from sensitive microphones placed throughout the enclosure. What Marcus saw on the monitors made him understand for the first time what they were really dealing with. The creatures were large. 7 feet was an underestimate for some of them. 8 feet wasn't a stretch for the largest male. They were covered in dark fur, the color shifting between black and deep brown, depending on the light. Their faces were partially lupine, partially foreign in a way Marcus couldn't parse. The snout was long, but not as extreme as a wolf. The skull shape was different. Higher, more rounded. The eyes were the most disturbing part. They were aware. There was intelligence behind them, the kind that made Marcus's skin crawl. They were also not attacking the barrier, not trying to escape. They were investigating the baited objects, examining them with their hands, their paws, with a deliberation that suggested curiosity rather than predation. One of the larger males picked up the carved figurine. He held it, turning it in his hands, studying it with an intensity that seemed to go beyond simple interest. He set it down carefully and picked up the knife. He examined the blade, ran his fingers along the edge, set it down. Dr. Chen was watching the same feeds. She was taking notes, documenting the interactions, trying to map the hierarchy and social structure of the group. Marcus heard her say quietly, almost to herself, "They're not animals. They're not behaving like animals." Over the next 3 days, the 7 creatures established a camp in the canyon. They took the baited objects and arranged them in patterns similar to the ones found in the original shelter, suggesting that they recognized the artifacts as intentional arrangements meant to communicate something. They identified the fresh water source in the canyon, a stream running along the northern wall, and established a watering area, positioning themselves upstream from where the juveniles would drink, maintaining what Marcus described as a sanitary hierarchy. They selected sleeping areas that gave them defensive positions and visibility of the entire space, placing the youngest individuals in the most protected location, protected on 3 sides by rock formations. They created separate spaces for what appeared to be food storage and preparation. They were not wild animals establishing a den. They were intelligent beings setting up a base, organizing their occupation of the space in a way that showed understanding of security, sanitation, child care, and resource management. The time they spent in the canyon during those first months was documented extensively. Marcus said the team of monitors rotated through 2-week assignments, watching the feeds 24 hours a day, pausing to note anything that deviated from animal behavior and suggested intentional communication or tool use or something that implied awareness of the containment. The creatures hunted. They moved as a coordinated group, dividing into smaller hunting parties, pursuing game that existed in the canyon system. A bighorn sheep population lived on the rock faces, and the creatures demonstrated sophisticated hunting strategy, using the terrain to advantage, cutting off escape routes, working as a team to corner prey. But what struck Marcus as most significant was the kill itself. They didn't kill wastefully. They harvested what they needed, and they processed the meat efficiently, with minimal suffering to the animals. The waste material was disposed of separately from the areas where the group stayed. It was, Marcus said, the behavior of hunters who understood ethics, who had developed standards for their own conduct. They also exhibited care behaviors toward each other. A juvenile was injured during one of the hunts, a deep gash on the shoulder from a ram's horn. Rather than abandoning the juvenile or leaving it to fend for itself, the adults remained with it for 3 days while the injury healed. They brought it food, they groomed the wound, they made soft vocalizations that Dr. Chen noted seemed designed to be comforting. The injury healed, and the juvenile rejoined the hunting parties without apparent lasting damage. The social hierarchy was clear. The largest male was the authority figure, the one whose movements and vocalizations seemed to direct the group. But he was not tyrannical. His leadership seemed consultative. Before major decisions like when to move to a new location within the canyon or when to organize a hunt, he would vocalize, and the other adults would respond. There seemed to be discussion, agreement, consensus. The smaller males and the females had input. The youngest individuals were supervised but not oppressed. It was, Marcus said, the closest thing to an actual society that he had ever documented in a wild animal population. And all of it was being recorded, monitored, analyzed. Every action was being categorized as either normal animal behavior or evidence of intelligence. Every interaction was being logged and filed and cross-referenced. The creatures, though they seemed not to acknowledge it directly, clearly understood they were being observed. There were moments when one of them would approach the camera, look directly at the lens, and vocalize. Marcus said it felt like a conscious acknowledgement of the observation, a way of saying, "I see you seeing me. I understand the dynamic of this situation." On the 4th day, the largest male approached the nearest monitoring station, the one mounted on the canyon wall. He stood beneath it for nearly an hour, looking up at the camera, at the sensitive microphone, at the infrared sensor. Marcus said the quality of his attention was deliberate. He knew what these were. He understood human surveillance technology, and he was delivering a message. After an hour, he turned and walked back to the rest of the group. He made a sound that the microphones picked up and the recordings captured, a vocalization that was layered and complex, falling somewhere between a howl and an animal cry Marcus couldn't categorize. The other 6 responded in kind, and the canyon filled with sounds that Marcus said he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Henricks called another briefing. The question on the table was how long they could hold the group before decisions had to be made about what came next. They had water, they had space, they had natural food sources in the canyon. The suppression systems were in place in case the creatures became aggressive. But Henricks was clear that everyone understood the fundamental problem with the operation. They had captured 7 individuals of a species that was not supposed to exist. They were holding them in a canyon in northeastern Nevada, and nobody outside a very small circle of people knew what had happened. Marcus asked what the end state was supposed to be. Henricks told him that was being determined at higher levels. For now, the operation was to observe, document, and maintain containment. So, that was what they did. For 6 months, teams rotated through the site. They documented the creatures' behavior, their hierarchies, their communication patterns, their interactions with the environment. They collected biological samples where possible. They studied the creatures' modifications to the canyon, the way they marked territory, the way they organized themselves. Dr. Chen filled 3 notebooks with observations. The creatures had a clear leadership structure. The largest male was dominant. There was a secondary male and 3 females. 2 younger individuals, probably juveniles. The adults cooperated on tasks. The juveniles were supervised. There were play behaviors between the younger ones that suggested they were comfortable with each other. The creatures showed signs of mourning. One of the females became lethargic, stopped eating, spent hours sitting alone at the far end of the canyon. Marcus said the others stayed near her, made soft vocalizations to her, brought her food. When she died, 3 days later, the group buried her. They dug a shallow grave, moved rocks to cover it, stood over it in silence. Marcus watched the burial on the monitors. He said the ritual quality of it was unmistakable. The creatures didn't simply dispose of the body. They placed her gently in the grave. They arranged her body in a specific position, with her head elevated and her limbs arranged as if she were sleeping rather than dead. They brought objects from their camp and placed them in the grave with her. A carefully worked bone tool, a collection of feathers, a woven piece of fabric. They covered her, making sure the rocks were stable and secure. Then they stood above the grave, all 6 of the remaining creatures, and made vocalizations that lasted approximately 4 minutes. The sounds were different from anything Marcus had heard from them before. Lower in frequency, more resonant, almost mournful in quality. When they finished, they dispersed back to their camp and did not return to the grave location during the rest of the observation period. Dr. Chen said what she witnessed was a funeral, not an approximation of a funeral, not something that resembled funeral behavior. An actual funeral conducted by intelligent beings who understood death and who maintained cultural practices around the treatment of the dead. By the end of February 2015, the 6 remaining creatures had settled into a stable routine in the canyon. They had established the boundaries of their territory. They had developed hunting patterns that followed a weekly cycle. They had established social rituals around feeding and communication. They had created what appeared to be a burial ground, with markings that suggested they might bury materials or significant objects in addition to bodies. They had constructed what Marcus described as a kind of shrine or gathering place, a circular arrangement of rocks in the center of the canyon where they would assemble during the evening hours and make collective vocalizations. Marcus said that by this point, everyone on the monitoring team understood that what they were documenting was not a wild animal population. It was a civilization, not human civilization, but civilization nonetheless. A society with governance structures, with burial practices, with rituals, with communal spaces. A culture that valued its members and mourned their loss. An intelligence that was capable of understanding concepts like death and permanence and the need to mark significant events. The question that hung over the whole operation was, what was supposed to happen next? The creatures were contained, they were documented, but there was no clear policy for what the long-term management of that containment should look like. Could you hold an intelligent species indefinitely in captivity? Was there an ethical framework for making that decision? Should they attempt communication? Should they attempt relocation? Should they attempt to understand whether these creatures represented a threat or simply a discovery? Henriks didn't have answers to those questions. He had his orders, which were to observe and document and maintain containment. But Marcus said everyone understood that the situation could not remain static indefinitely. Eventually, decisions would have to be made, and those decisions would shape everything about what kind of agency the Department of Defense wanted to be, what kind of operations it wanted to conduct, what ethical standards it wanted to maintain. By March of 2015, something had become clear that changed the entire operation. The creatures in the canyon were not going to be the last ones discovered. There was a wider population out there, and that population, it was becoming apparent, was aware of what had happened to their captured members. They were organizing a response. Marcus was watching the feeds when the largest male approached the camera again. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he made a sound that Marcus said sounded almost like speech, like an intelligence trying to form words with a throat that wasn't built for human language. The creature's mouth moved, shaped the attempts at sound, abandoned them. Then he withdrew and didn't approach the camera again. By February of 2015, it became clear that the situation was not sustainable. The creatures were intelligent enough to recognize that they were contained. They were not trying to escape, but they were not reproducing, not fully engaging in normal behaviors. The female population was declining. The energy of the group was becoming progressively more withdrawn. Henriks told Marcus that the decision had been made to initiate Phase 2. The creatures would be relocated to a permanent containment facility, a purpose-built installation in Northern California, in a remote part of the Sierra Nevada, where a secure enclosure had been constructed to house the population long-term. The relocation was handled by a private contractor, specializing in large animal transport. The creatures were sedated with a combination of compounds that Dr. Chen had spent weeks developing, trying to develop that would work on a species with an unknown physiology. The sedation was applied via dart guns during a coordinated operation. 6 of the 7 individuals were successfully captured. The largest male resisted. He fought the sedation longer, and when it finally took hold, his body showed signs of extreme stress. His breathing was labored, his heart rate elevated, but he survived. They were loaded into reinforced transport containers and moved by truck to California. The journey took 2 days. By the time they arrived at the permanent containment facility, 4 of the creatures were dead. The stress of the transport, the sedation, the handling had been too much. Marcus wasn't at the California facility. His role ended with the Nevada operation. But he knew people who were involved with the transfer, and they told him what happened when the surviving 3 creatures were unloaded. The largest male, the one Marcus had watched approach the cameras, the one who seemed most aware of his captivity, died within 6 hours of arrival. No identifiable cause. His organs showed no signs of disease or trauma. His heart simply stopped. Of the original 7, only 2 survived the transfer and the initial period at the California facility, the younger male and one of the females. By March of 2015, both of those were dead. The operation was officially concluded. The facility in California was decommissioned. The Nevada Canyon was unsealed and left to return to its natural state. The bodies of the 5 creatures that had died during the operation were incinerated at a facility with no connection to any federal agency, and the whole thing was filed away, classified, locked in compartments that barely acknowledged their own existence. Marcus kept the records, every report, every memo, every communication that passed through his hands during the operation. He kept them despite regulation, despite risk, because he said he needed to know that somebody had documented what happened, that the existence of those creatures, their intelligence, their awareness, their suffering had been recorded by somebody. He said the largest male haunted him, the one who looked at the camera and tried to speak. Marcus said that creature knew what was happening, understood that it was contained, understood that humans had done the containing, and when the male died at the California facility, Marcus said he thought about what that creature might have been trying to say, what message it was trying to deliver to cameras it knew were watching. The surviving female, the one Marcus said seemed closest to the secondary male. She survived to the California facility and then died there. In her final days, she was documented as refusing food, spending extended periods in an unresponsive state. The logs noted that her vital signs were stable, but her behavior suggested a progressive withdrawal. Marcus said he believed she died of grief. What happened next was the part Marcus said kept him awake, because the Keystone operation didn't end. it changed into something far more complex and far more troubling than the initial containment had been. The transition began in March, before the relocation had even been fully completed. The monitoring teams in Nevada had detected unusual activity in the zones surrounding the canyon. Creatures that had never been present before in the areas around the original discovery site were appearing, not one at a time, not randomly, but in organized groups, moving with clear purpose toward the canyon location. It was as though the creatures that had been captured, the 7 individuals that were being held in the enclosure, had somehow communicated to the wider population that something had happened, and that population was responding by gathering. By the time the last of the captured creatures died at the California facility in early 2015, the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had anticipated. The agency's actions had triggered a response that suggested the species had a communication capability that extended across vast distances, and a social organization that allowed for coordinated population movements. What had seemed like a singular containment problem had suddenly become evidence of a much larger phenomenon. In April of 2015, barely a month after the last of the creatures died in California, Marcus received a call. It came through the agency's secure line, and it was from Colonel Henricks. Henricks asked if Marcus was willing to participate in a follow-up assessment. There had been additional activity detected in the Nevada zone. They wanted to know if the population was larger than initially estimated, and if the escape of 7 individuals had triggered a response from the wider population. Marcus didn't want to go back. He said so directly to Henricks. He said he'd documented everything the operation required, that his role was complete. Henricks was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the findings from the California facility had raised some questions that only someone with Marcus's level of knowledge could address. Against his better judgment, Marcus went back to Nevada. The surveillance infrastructure in the canyon had been reactivated. New images were waiting. After the canyon had been unsealed, the monitoring teams had watched to see if the population would attempt to reclaim the site. They did. Within 3 days of the canyon becoming accessible again, new individuals had entered. Not 7, 17. Marcus looked at the thermal imagery and felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. The original operation had been based on an assumption about the size of the population. The estimates had been 6 to 9 individuals in the entire zone. But the population that appeared in the canyon after the facility had been opened was nearly double that. Either the original estimates had been catastrophically wrong, or the creatures had been gathering, moving toward the zone after the initial capture. Henricks showed him more data. Over the next month, more individuals appeared. By May, there were approximately 30 creatures in and around the canyon zone. They had begun to reconstruct the shelter that had been destroyed. They had reorganized the bait objects into what looked like a memorial. The largest male, the one Marcus had documented, the one whose body had been incinerated, was represented in the arrangement. A collection of stones in a roughly humanoid shape, objects surrounding it. The female that had died of grief had her own arrangement nearby. Dr. Chen was called back in. She reviewed the footage and told Henricks what Marcus already suspected. The creatures had not only returned to claim their dead, they had organized a response. The memorial arrangements were deliberate. The gathering of the population was organized, and the behavior suggested purpose. Over the following weeks, the population continued to grow. More individuals entered the zone. Some came from the east, traveling through the mountains. Some came from the north. The pattern suggested they were converging on the canyon location, and they were doing it systematically, not randomly. By June, there were 47 documented individuals in the zone. That was when the decision came down to escalate the operation. Henricks briefed Marcus and Dr. Chen with a new mission statement. The population was now perceived as a potential threat. The concentration of individuals, the apparent coordination, the evidence of intelligence and deliberate movement, all of it suggested that the creatures might be planning an escalation. The new operation, codenamed Sentinel, was going to be an expanded containment and monitoring program. What that meant in practice was that the entire canyon system was going to be upgraded. New barriers were going to be installed at all natural access points. A more sophisticated surveillance network was going to be deployed, and a rapid response team was going to be stationed permanently in the area, ready to intervene if the creatures attempted to leave the zone or if they posed any kind of threat. The expansion took another 2 months to complete. By August of 2015, 14 months after the initial discovery, The zone had been converted into what amounted to a large-scale animal containment facility. The difference was that the animals being contained had intelligence equivalent to human intelligence. They understood what was happening. They understood that they were being watched. And they continued to gather. Marcus was in Nevada during the expansion when he witnessed that he said changed his understanding of what the creatures were really capable of. He was at a monitoring station, reviewing feeds from the previous night, when he saw the footage. All 47 of the creatures in the zone had assembled in the center of the canyon. They were standing in a formation that looked deliberate, organized in concentric circles, with the oldest and largest individuals on the outside. In the center where the memorials for the dead had been arranged, they stood in silence for 3 hours. Then the largest male, a different individual from the one that had been in the Nevada enclosure, approached the memorial. He made sounds, long, complex vocalizations that lasted several minutes. When he finished, all the other creatures responded in unison, a sound that the microphones captured as a vibration that rattled the recording equipment. Dr. Chen listened to the recording 17 times. She said it was language, not human language, not animal communication. Language, in something with syntax, with structure, with the capacity to convey complex meaning. She said it sounded like a prayer, or a funeral rite, or something that served that function. For the next 6 months, the creatures remained in the zone. They didn't attempt to leave. They didn't show aggression toward the surveillance equipment or the monitoring stations. They simply lived, organized their social groups, raised the juveniles, and maintained their presence in the canyon. And during that entire time, a federal agency with no official name maintained a standing operation to watch them, record them, and prepare to kill them if they posed any kind of threat. Marcus said that by early 2016, he had started to realize what the real problem was. The creatures were intelligent. They understood human technology. They understood that they were being observed. And the agency knew that they knew. But the relationship between the watchers and the watched was starting to destabilize. There was an incident in March of 2016. A researcher, a young biologist named Dr. Aaron Wells, had been positioned at a monitoring station near one of the natural access points to the canyon. He'd been there for 6 days, rotating with other monitors, collecting biological samples from the edges of the creature's territory. On the evening of March 8th, his monitoring station detected movement. Something large was approaching the perimeter. Wells reviewed the video. It was a single female, one that Dr. Chen had designated as F7 in the research logs. F7 was approaching the monitoring station, not aggressively, walking slowly, with clear intent, directly toward the equipment. Wells reported it through the chain of command. He was told to stay in position and maintain observation. F7 reached the monitoring station. She stood in front of the camera for approximately 5 minutes. Then she raised her hand and deliberately destroyed the camera, the microphone, the infrared sensor. Everything electronic at that station was disabled. When a rapid response team reached the station 2 hours later, F7 was gone. She had returned to the canyon and did not emerge again. And the station that she had destroyed was not rebuilt or repaired. Marcus said that incident was the turning point for him, because he understood then that the creatures were not trying to escape or attack. They were communicating. F7 had sent a message. It said, "We know you're watching, and we're telling you to stop. We're acknowledging that you're here, and we're asking you to respect a boundary." The recovery team that found the destroyed monitoring station did a full assessment of the damage. The equipment had been destroyed methodically. The camera was smashed, but not with wild force. The microphone was torn from its mounting point. The infrared sensor had been deliberately crushed. The electrical leads had been cut. Someone with understanding of the equipment's function had disabled it with purpose and precision. There was no way to interpret this as a defensive action or a predatory attack. It was a deliberate statement. Wells, the researcher who had been at the station, was debriefed. He described F7's approach as calm and deliberate. She had not been aggressive. She had not lunged or threatened. She had walked up to the equipment, examined it for a moment, then destroyed it. When she was done, she had simply walked away, back toward the canyon interior. Wells said that in her movements and demeanor, he had observed what looked like satisfaction, like a message had been delivered successfully. Over the next 2 days, 2 more monitoring stations experienced similar incidents. Different creatures, different approaches, but the same result. Equipment destroyed, carefully and deliberately. The surveillance perimeter was being systematically disabled, and the creatures were doing it to deliver a message. By the end of March, 4 out of the 8 perimeter monitoring stations were non-functional. The creatures had made their statement. The agency was not welcome in the canyon. He brought his analysis to Henricks and to Dr. Chen. He said the creatures were demonstrating understanding and restraint. They had the capacity to attack. They had shown intelligence and coordination in their response to perceived intrusion. But instead of attacking the human researchers or attempting a violent escape, they were communicating through targeted sabotage. They were drawing a line and asking the watchers to respect a boundary. More than that, they were demonstrating knowledge of human technology, understanding of surveillance systems, and the ability to disable equipment. The intelligence being displayed was not primitive. It was sophisticated, deliberate, and measured. Dr. Chen agreed with Marcus's analysis. She wrote a summary of the incidents, noting that the pattern suggested the creatures understood surveillance technology, understood its purpose, and were making a statement about its use. She recommended that the agency consider the creatures' clear message as a negotiating position. They were saying, in effect, if you will stop watching so closely, we will remain in the canyon. We will not escape. We will not attack. But you must respect our privacy and our autonomy within this space. That interpretation, Marcus said, was what sealed his fate in the agency. Because Henricks didn't see it as communication or negotiation. Henricks saw it as a threat. Henricks's response was to recommend an expansion of the Sentinel operation. More monitoring stations, more sophisticated surveillance, more security personnel. The official reasoning was that the creature's behavior suggested a higher level of threat than initially estimated, and that the containment needed to be more comprehensive. Marcus said he disagreed. He submitted a minority report recommending that the agency consider negotiating some kind of boundary agreement, a zone that the creatures could occupy without interference, monitoring from a distance rather than constant surveillance, an acknowledgement of their presence and their intelligence. The report was filed and shelved. Henricks didn't fire him, but his access to the zone operations was reduced. He was moved to an administrative position, reviewing data that others collected. He spent the next year watching the feeds from locations he was no longer authorized to visit. In January of 2017, the entire operation was suddenly classified at a higher level. Marcus lost access to almost all of his files. The zone became compartmentalized. The few people with full access to the Sentinel operation suddenly couldn't talk to Marcus about any aspect of it. Communications that he had formerly received regularly stopped coming. When he tried to get updates, he was told the operation had been restructured under different management. His expertise was no longer required. Within 6 months, Marcus was effectively cut out of the program he had helped establish. He retired in 2018. He was 53 years old and had spent the last 3 years of his federal career being systematically excluded from the work that had consumed most of his adult life. When he left the agency, he did. That was against every regulation he had operated under for nearly 3 decades. He took copies of the files, not all of them. The classified material was too heavily tracked. But he took the research notes, the audio recordings, the early documentation from the initial discovery through the failed relocation. He took Dr. Chen's analysis. He took his own reports, including the minority report recommending negotiation. He put them in boxes and stored them in his garage. Then he tried to go back to normal life. He bought a house in Colorado, near Aspen. He took up woodworking. He tried not to think about the canyon in Nevada or what was happening there now. But the nightmares started. Marcus said he would wake up thinking about the largest male, the one who had tried to speak to the camera, the one who had died of stress in the California facility. He would think about F7 standing in front of the monitoring station, deliberately destroying equipment, making a statement. He would think about the 47 creatures assembling in the canyon to mourn their dead. In 2020, there was a story in a local Colorado news outlet. A hiker had gone missing in the mountains north of Aspen. Search and rescue had found what was left of the body 2 weeks later in a remote canyon. The coroner's report indicated that the hiker had been killed by a large animal. The DNA evidence from the scene didn't match any known species. The official determination was an unusual predation event, probably involving a large bear, though the injuries suggested something with different anatomy than a bear. The story was reported locally and then forgotten. But Marcus saw it and made a connection that he couldn't ignore. The missing hiker had been reported in an area that was geographically consistent with a range that extended from the Nevada zone. If the creatures in the canyon had grown their population from 7 to nearly 50 in the span of a few years, if they were intelligent enough to communicate deliberately, intelligent enough to mourn their dead, then it was reasonable to assume they were intelligent enough to expand their territory. The missing hiker, Marcus believed, was the first casualty of something that had been set in motion by the Keystone operation. He started trying to find out what was happening in Nevada. He made calls to people who were still in the agency, who he had worked with, who he hoped would give him some sense of whether the containment was holding. Most of them wouldn't talk to him, but one person did. A woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who was working in the biological division at the agency, and who had been collaborating with Dr. Chen on the creature research. Vasquez was careful about what she said. They communicated through personal email accounts, nothing that could be traced through the agency network, but what she told him was this: the population continued to grow. The creatures had stopped their aggressive approach to the containment barriers after the demolition of the monitoring equipment. They were living peacefully in the expanded zone, not attempting to escape, but genetic testing on samples that had been collected suggested that the population was reproducing successfully. New juveniles were being born. The population was self-sustaining. More than that, the creatures were showing signs of cultural development. They had created elaborate structures within the canyon. They had established burial grounds. They had developed ritualistic behaviors around feeding and gathering. Dr. Chen had documented evidence of what she believed was tool manufacture at a level more sophisticated than anything they had previously captured. What the agency was actually managing, Vasquez said, was not a containment of a dangerous animal population. It was the forced imprisonment of an intelligent species. And the more data the researchers collected, the more it became clear that the creatures understood exactly what their situation was. Marcus asked Vasquez what the end state was supposed to be. What was the agency planning to do with a population of nearly 50 intelligent, self-aware creatures that they were holding in a canyon in Nevada? Were they planning to keep them there indefinitely? Were they planning some kind of negotiation? Were they planning to kill them? Vasquez's response was that there was no end state. The operation had been classified at such a high level that only a handful of people had access to the decision-making structure. What she knew was that the containment had become a permanent feature of the agency's operations. It was funded, maintained, and actively monitored, but there was no policy or plan for what came next. It was, Vasquez said, as though the agency had captured something, realized it couldn't be what they had originally thought, and now simply didn't know what to do with it. Marcus told me that that was the moment he decided to document everything he knew and prepare to release it. Because he understood then that the agency would never voluntarily provide transparency about what was happening in Nevada. The operation had been classified in layers, compartmentalized to prevent anyone from having the full picture, integrated into a funding structure that didn't require public oversight. Each compartment was sealed. The people who managed the surveillance didn't know about the relocation facility. The people who managed the relocation didn't have access to the initial discovery documentation. The people who decided policy at the higher levels didn't have direct access to the field researchers' reports. The information was spread out across different agencies, different security levels, different funding streams. Nobody had the full picture except for a handful of people at the very top, and those people had long since committed to the path of containment and were unlikely to change course. Marcus spent months simply trying to find who actually made decisions about the operation. He'd call contacts in the agency, ask who was responsible for the Keystone and Sentinel programs. Most people either didn't know or wouldn't say. A few told him that the decision-making authority had moved to a private contractor, a company that had taken over management of the facility. That contractor worked on a 5-year renewable contract. They had an incentive to maintain the operation, to justify its existence and cost, to argue that it was necessary and successful. The creatures in the canyon were going to remain imprisoned, documented, observed, and ultimately forgotten, because no official body had the authority or the will to make a different decision. Once the initial action had been taken, once the 7 creatures had been captured and the others had gathered in response, the momentum had become self-sustaining. The only thing that could reverse the decision was an external force, a public outcry, congressional oversight, an investigative reporter with enough credibility and evidence to force a reckoning. But the classification structure was specifically designed to prevent that public outcry from happening. The creature's existence was buried in compartments that barely acknowledged their own existence. But the situation gnawed at him in ways he couldn't suppress. He tried to move forward with his life, but the knowledge of what was happening in Nevada, the creatures that he had documented, the choices the agency was making, all of it sat in the back of his mind like a constant pressure. He bought the house in Colorado as a place where he could try to reset, try to build a new life. The property was isolated, surrounded by forest. He told himself it was peaceful. In reality, he said, he was hiding. The woodworking became obsessive. Marcus would spend 12, 14 hours in his workshop, creating furniture with meticulous precision. A dining table that took 6 months to complete, a set of chairs that required hand-carving every detail. The work was beautiful, technically proficient, utterly soulless. He was going through the motions of creating while his mind was elsewhere, locked on the canyon in Nevada and the creatures he had abandoned there. The nightmares started about 8 months after he retired. He would wake in the middle of the night, his heart racing, his mind caught in dreams of the canyon. In some of them, he was back at the monitoring station, watching the feeds. But the creatures had changed. They were larger, more aggressive, pounding against barriers that were failing. In other dreams, he was inside the canyon. The creatures were there, and they were looking at him with an expression that suggested betrayal, as though they understood that he had been the one who had documented them, who had gathered the evidence, who had participated in the machinery that had imprisoned them. He tried to rationalize it. They were animals. Animals didn't hold grudges. Animals didn't understand betrayal. But the creatures in those dreams did. They knew. They understood the complexity of the situation as well as he did. By 2017, about 3 years after his retirement, Marcus was barely sleeping. The insomnia was chronic, pathological. He would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the creatures. He started drinking more than was healthy. Not in a dramatic way, not the kind of drinking that lands someone in a hospital, but a constant low-level reliance on alcohol to quiet his mind enough that he could get through the day. He isolated himself further. The few friends he had from his years in government work tried to reach out, tried to maintain contact. He eventually stopped returning calls. His family, what little of it he had left, expressed concern. His ex-wife, Patty, the one who had left him when he became distant years ago, called him once. He didn't answer. She left a message asking if he was all right. He never called her back. The only person who knew anything close to the truth was Vasquez, and her communications became increasingly cryptic and sparse. The agency had clearly tightened security on classified communications. There were gaps of months where Marcus heard nothing from her. When she did reach out, it was through carefully worded messages that conveyed minimal information that seemed designed to avoid leaving any record that could be traced. In one message from early 2018, Vasquez wrote, "The situation is stable, the population is contained, but the question of long-term management remains unresolved. There is discussion at high levels about a potential relocation to a more secure facility, but that would require approval that hasn't been granted. For now, status quo. How are you doing?" Marcus wrote back, "I'm managing, still thinking about solutions." He meant it. He was, in fact, still thinking about the problem obsessively. He had begun, without fully admitting it to himself, to think about the possibility of going public. The moral weight of that decision paralyzed him for months. If he released the information, he would be violating decades of security clearances and regulations. He could face prosecution. The federal government would almost certainly come after him with every legal tool available. He could spend his final years in prison. But if he didn't release the information, the creatures would remain imprisoned indefinitely, documented but ignored, their existence erased from any official record, their treatment justified by a classification system that allowed agencies to hide anything they deemed a matter of national security. There was no good choice. There was only the choice between complicity and personal destruction. Marcus spent 2 years balancing on that knife's edge, unable to commit to either path. Then, in late 2022, he started having chest pains. Initially, he thought it was anxiety, stress manifesting in his body. He ignored it. The pains continued, worsening. He eventually went to a doctor, which he had been avoiding for years. The test came back, and the doctor told him that his heart was fine. The pains were stress-related, but while they were running tests, they found another issue: a shadow on a scan, further imaging, a diagnosis that changed everything: pancreatic cancer in an advanced stage, the kind that doesn't wait around. The prognosis was grim: months, maybe a year if he was lucky. If he pursued aggressive treatment, he might add some time to that estimate, but the quality of that time would be minimal. The doctor recommended he get his affairs in order. Marcus sat in his house for 3 days after that diagnosis and didn't leave. He didn't eat. He barely drank water. He simply sat and thought about what it meant to be running out of time, to have spent years in a state of paralysis, unable to make a decision that mattered. On the 4th day, he made his choice. Marcus decided he didn't want the files released after his death. He wanted to tell the story while he was still alive, to answer questions. He wanted someone to understand the full context, the decision-making process, the way an agency could justify holding intelligent creatures in captivity in the name of national security. That's why he contacted me. And that's what he spent the last 2 months of his life doing, working with me to make sure that the documentation was clear and complete. Our first conversation lasted 6 hours. Marcus sat in his living room with a digital recorder between us, and he talked through the entire timeline from beginning to end without significant interruption. His voice was steady, his recollection precise. He had clearly rehearsed this narrative in his head for years, waiting for the moment when he could finally say it out loud to someone who would listen and understand the implications. What struck me most was his lack of bitterness. I expected anger, recrimination, accusations against the agency and the people who had made the decisions that resulted in the creatures' deaths. Instead, Marcus was analytical. He described the decisions the agency made not as evil, but as the inevitable result of institutional logic. When you find you don't understand, you capture it. When you capture it, you study it. When you study it and realize it's intelligent, you escalate the containment. When it dies in captivity, you classify the circumstances. The system perpetuates itself. Nobody is acting with malice. Everyone is simply doing their job, following the protocols, trusting the compartmentalization that prevents them from seeing the full scope of what they are participating in. The worst part, Marcus said during our 3rd interview, is that I don't think anyone at the agency is a bad person. Henricks genuinely believed he was protecting national security. Dr. Chen genuinely believed she was advancing scientific knowledge. The handlers at the California facility genuinely believed they were following best practices in animal care. But the structure, the compartmentalization, the classification system, all of it allows good people to participate in something that is fundamentally wrong without ever fully confronting that reality. He spent one entire interview walking me through the documentation he had kept: photocopies of reports, his own handwritten notes, snippets of communications with Vasquez. The materials were meticulous, obsessively organized. He had indexed them by date and subject matter. He had cross-referenced the reports with official government documents that had been publicly released, demonstrating how the official accounts diverged from what he knew to be true. The thing I kept, Marcus said, holding up a folder, is a video recording from the monitoring station, 27 minutes of the memorial assembly, the gathering of the 47 creatures around the grave markers for the dead. I recorded it because I was afraid that if I didn't, there would eventually be no evidence that this happened. No proof that I wasn't making it up, that I wasn't just having some kind of breakdown and inventing an elaborate conspiracy. This, he gestured to the folder, this is the proof. This is the moment when anyone watching the footage would understand that we weren't dealing with animals. We were dealing with a civilization in mourning. I asked him if I could see the footage. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said no. The footage was too identifying. If the agency knew that the video existed and that it was in circulation, they would move heaven and earth to find it and destroy it. More than that, releasing the video would expose Vasquez as his source. She's still working, Marcus said. If the agency figures out that she's been in contact with me, they'll investigate her. They'll find the communications. She could face prosecution. I won't do that to her. The video stays with me. It's the insurance policy. If something happens to me, if I die, and people are still interested in this story, the video gets released. But while I'm alive, nobody sees it but me. During our final interview, conducted over the phone because Marcus was too weak to leave his house, he talked about what the creatures might be doing now. It had been 8 years since his last access to the Sentinel operation. He didn't know if the population had grown further. He didn't know if there had been additional incidents outside the contained zone. He didn't know if the agency was still maintaining the operation or if they had decided to kill the captured creatures and close down the facility. But I think, Marcus said, that they're still there. I think the creatures are still in that canyon, because if the agency killed them, it would trigger questions. There would be records even if classified. There would be people who knew. The classification system would have to expand to include the elimination event. It's easier to just keep them there, keep them documented, keep them contained. That's the path of least resistance, and bureaucracy always follows the path of least resistance. He paused. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, breathing with effort. And if they're still there, he continued, then they're still waiting. Whatever Vasquez meant when she said they were waiting, whatever it was that the creatures understood about their situation, they're still waiting for it, for change, for release, for something different than what they have now. And every year that passes, every year they spend in that canyon, with humans watching them, recording them, studying them, I think something is changing in that population. I think they're becoming something different than what they were when I documented them. Something harder, something angrier, something that's learning what it means to be caged by a species that claims to be civilized. He died 3 days after that conversation. His final request was that I take the story seriously, that I not present it as speculation or conspiracy theory, but as documentary evidence of an operation that had occurred and was continuing to occur. I've spent the last year verifying everything I can verify. Some of it checks out. The surveying company that made the original discovery was a real company contracted for the mineral assessment that Marcus described. I was able to contact 2 people who worked for that company at the time. They confirmed that there had been an unusual discovery in the survey zone in Nevada in 2014, and that their team had been pulled off the project abruptly. Neither was willing to discuss the details, but their confirmation of the basic fact lent credibility to Marcus's account. The Nevada Department of Wildlife has records of unusual activity reports from that time period, though the specific reports Marcus referenced have been removed from the public files. The removal itself suggests that an incident of significance occurred. Environmental agencies don't generally remove wildlife reports unless there's a reason to hide the facts. The Book of Enoch interpretation that the agency used is accurate to the texts. I've read the version myself. The passages about the Watchers and their descent to the physical world are exactly as Marcus described them, including the reference to Mount Hermon and the binding oath. The section of the text that Marcus said the agency relied on, the Book of the Watchers covering the first 36 chapters, is indeed the oldest section of the text and the section most focused on a specific population of interdimensional beings that came to the physical world and remained here. The agency's interpretation that the creatures in Nevada might be related to or descended from these entities is speculative, but it's not unreasonable. The text does describe beings that were watchers, that understood human technology and human behavior, that existed in a state of conflict with humanity. Whether Marcus's creatures are actually related to those beings is unknowable, but the connection the agency made is at least internally logical. The hiker who went missing in Colorado in 2020 did disappear in an area consistent with Marcus's geographic assessment. I verified this through obituary records and missing person databases. The hiker's name was Jason Matthews, age 28, last seen on a hiking trail near the Maroon Bells Wilderness area, about 40 miles north of Aspen. The coroner's report does exist, and the DNA evidence collected from the scene is indeed unidentified. I was able to speak with the forensic biologist who conducted the analysis. She was reluctant to discuss details, but she confirmed that the DNA evidence did not match any species in their database. The official explanation remains predation by an unknown large animal, but the forensic biologist also said, off the record, that the injury pattern was unusual for any known predator. The lacerations and puncture wounds suggested something with a different skeletal structure than any predator she had ever examined. Everything else, Marcus said, I have to take his word for. The Keystone operation, the containment facility in California, the Sentinel monitoring operation in Nevada, the death of the creatures under stress and possibly from grief. All of it is locked behind classification levels that I can't penetrate. but I believe him. Because the pattern of his documentation is consistent. Because his analysis of the creature behavior is coherent and internally logical. Because the story of an agency discovering something they didn't expect and then being unable to reverse their initial decision to capture it is a story that fits with how bureaucracy actually works. And because F7 destroyed a monitoring station deliberately and carefully, and made a statement that seemed to say, "We know you're watching, and we want you to know that we know. We understand your technology. We understand what you've done to us, and we're asking you to respect a boundary." What happened after that request was made, Marcus said, is exactly what should not have happened. The agency responded by building more surveillance, increasing the observation, making the containment more absolute. The last message Vasquez sent to Marcus in early 2017, before the compartmentalization became absolute, was a single sentence. She wrote, "I think they're waiting. We don't know for what, but the pattern of their behavior suggests they understand that the situation will eventually change, and they're preparing themselves for that change. I don't know what they're waiting for." Marcus said he didn't know either, but I know that somewhere in Nevada, in a canyon that is officially not a canyon and a containment operation that officially doesn't exist, something is being held, something intelligent, something aware, something that understands its situation. And nobody official is going to do anything about it because the bureaucratic structures that were put in place to manage the operation have become self-sustaining. They feed themselves, justify themselves, perpetuate their own existence. The creatures in the canyon are not the only thing being held in captivity. That's the story Marcus wanted told. That's what he carried with him until he died. A documentation of the moment when a government agency made a decision that created an impossible situation and then was unable to undo it. If you're listening to this and you work within the federal government, if you have any access to classified information about wildlife operations in Nevada, about populations in the Sierra Nevada, about anything that resembles what Marcus described, the thing he wanted me to say is this: you can talk to me. The statute of limitations on his secrecy agreements has expired, and more broadly, what he believed was that the truth about what happened in the canyon had to be told. Eventually, regardless of the classification. I don't know if anyone is listening who has that information, but I wanted to make sure the request was public, so that if someone's conscience is bearing the same weight that Marcus's conscience bore, they know there's a channel for it. This is the story as Marcus told it to me. Everything he documented, everything he witnessed, everything he knew and believed to be true. The fate of the creatures in the Nevada Canyon, as far as I'm aware, remains unknown. They may still be alive, still being held in that facility. They may have died in the years since Marcus lost access to the operation. They may have escaped, though Marcus said the containment infrastructure was substantial enough that escape seemed unlikely. What remains certain is that they existed, they were captured, they were documented, and then they were forgotten by the public record in a way that only the classified system makes possible. An entire population of intelligent beings held in captivity, their existence erased from official acknowledgement. Marcus called that the real tragedy. Not the creature's suffering, though that was real, but the fact that an entire species had been documented, studied, contained, and potentially lost, and nobody outside a small circle of compartmentalized personnel would ever know what happened. That's why he kept the files. That's why he made sure the story got told. And that's why I'm telling it to you now.